You are not going to believe what happened on that bus. We are going to go back to that exact moment, freeze it right there, and break down everything that was really going on between Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves. Because what looked like a simple blooper to most people was actually something much bigger. Something that had been building for months. And once you see it, you are never going to watch that movie the same way again. But to truly understand why that one moment hit so differently, you have to understand the two people it happened to. You have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when Sandra Bullock was still waiting tables and auditioning for anything that would have her, and Keanu Reeves was still being written off as just a pretty face who got lucky with Bill and Ted. Two people who had no business being as good together as they were. Two people who, by every measure of Hollywood logic, probably should never have ended up on that bus together at all. So let us start at the very beginning. Because the story of how that wet spot scene happened is really the story of two separate lives that were quietly moving toward each other for years before the cameras ever rolled. Sandra Bullock was born in 1964 in Arlington, Virginia, but she did not grow up in the way most people imagine a future Hollywood superstar growing up. Her mother, Helga, was a German opera singer who toured the grand opera houses of Europe. Her father, John, was an American who worked for the army. That combination meant young Sandra spent her childhood bouncing between Nuremberg, Vienna, and Salzburg, absorbing culture and language and music in a way that most kids from Arlington simply never get to do. She studied ballet. She sang in children's choirs. She watched her mother perform on enormous stages in front of thousands of people and quietly filed all of it away somewhere deep inside herself. When the family eventually moved back to Virginia, Sandra hit the ground running. She was a cheerleader. She was lighting up the school theater stage. She had that thing that is very hard to teach and impossible to fake, which is the ability to walk into a room and make every person in it feel like she walked in specifically for them. She followed that gift to East Carolina University and earned a drama degree in 1987, and then she did what every young actor with a dream and not much else does. She moved to New York City and got a job as a bartender. This part of her story matters more than people give it credit for. Because there is a version of Sandra Bullock who gets discovered early and never has to struggle, and that version of Sandra Bullock probably does not have the particular kind of warmth and hunger that made her so magnetic on screen. The Sandra Bullock who made Speed was a woman who had been grinding for 7 years before anyone really paid attention. She had done small TV movies. She had done a short-lived series called Working Girl. She had done an off-Broadway play that caught a few important eyes, but not quite enough of them. She was building something brick by brick while the rest of the world was not watching yet. And then came 1994. And everything changed. The movie that changed everything was not supposed to look the way it looked. The script for Speed came from a writer named Graham Yost, who got the initial seed of the idea from a conversation with his father about a 1985 film called Runaway Train. His father had mentioned to him that there was a bomb on the train in that movie. There was no bomb on the train. His father had simply misremembered. But that one small mistake planted something in Graham's brain that would eventually become one of the highest-grossing action films of the entire decade. The early versions of the script were wildly different from what ended up on screen. The bomb was originally set to go off if the bus dropped below just 20 miles per hour, which frankly does not sound that scary. A friend pushed Graham to raise it to 50, and suddenly the whole thing crackled with real danger. The climax was supposed to happen at Dodger Stadium, with the bus circling the parking lot before exploding near the Hollywood sign. Jeff Daniels' character, Harry, was originally written as the secret villain, which the producers eventually realized would never work because nobody in America was going to believe that Jeff Daniels was a cold-blooded murderer. Dennis Hopper's legendary villain Howard Payne was actually created less than a month before filming began. And the dialogue, the sharp, funny, human dialogue that made audiences fall in love with Jack and Annie as real people rather than action movie props, almost none of that was in the original script. A young writer named Joss Whedon was brought in as a script doctor and, according to Graham Yost himself, ended up writing close to 99% of the finished dialogue. Because of strict union rules, Whedon never received an official credit for his work, but he loved the movie so much that he had a custom Speed poster made with his name on it and kept it in his home for years. None of that behind-the-scenes chaos was visible when the film hit theaters in June of 1994. What audiences saw was a clean, terrifying, perfectly calibrated thrill ride that pulled in $350 million worldwide, won 2 Academy Awards, and redefined what an action movie could feel like when the two leads actually had real chemistry. Quentin Tarantino later called it one of his favorite movies of all time, saying there are very few films that deliver such a pure sense of exhilaration from the first frame to the last. But here is the thing about that chemistry. It very nearly did not happen. Before Keanu Reeves stepped into Jack Traven's boots, the studio had gone to Tom Cruise. They had gone to Tom Hanks. They had gone to Wesley Snipes. Director Jan de Bong eventually made the call to go with Keanu after watching him in Point Break, specifically because he wanted to take the actor the world still associated with Bill and Ted and prove that there was a serious, physical, emotionally grounded leading man underneath the surfer boy image. He pushed Keanu hard during production. He wanted him leaner, stronger, more present. And Keanu delivered. On the other side of the casting table, the role of Annie Porter went through a similarly wild journey. The character was originally written as a no-nonsense African-American paramedic, and it was first offered to Halle Berry. Halle turned it down. She later joked that the movie gods must have been off that day because once Sandra Bullock walked in, the part was always hers. Sandra did not just accept the role and show up. She went and passed a real bus driving test on her very first attempt, just so she would know exactly what it felt like to have her hands on that wheel when the cameras were rolling. The production itself was brutal in the best possible way. They were not shooting on a comfortable studio backlot. They were out on a real, unfinished stretch of the I-105 freeway in Los Angeles, baking in the California sun for weeks, dealing with real noise and real heat and real danger. One of the most famous stunts in the movie, the bus jumping over a gap in the freeway, came directly from Jan de Bong spotting that unfinished section of highway and deciding on the spot to use it. On the first attempt, the stunt driver missed the ramp entirely and crashed the bus. On the second attempt, they nailed it, but the bus flew 109 feet through the air, landed directly on top of a row of expensive cameras, and the crew had to digitally erase the pavement underneath the bus to make the gap look real. They even added birds flying through the empty space just to sell it. The production ran out of money before they could film the subway crash at the end. They showed the scene to a test audience using animated storyboards, and the reaction was so overwhelmingly positive that the studio quickly found the funds to finish it properly. The subway train that crashes into Hollywood Boulevard in the final film was actually a bus that had been decorated to look like a train. All of this was the backdrop. All of this was the fuel. But none of it was what people were actually talking about when they left the theater. What they were talking about was the two people on that bus and the way they looked at each other. Now let us get to the moment. Let us get to the scene. During the making of Speed, Keanu and Sandra were spending enormous amounts of time in close proximity under genuinely stressful conditions. Keanu was carrying something heavy during production that most people did not fully know about at the time. His best friend, the actor River Phoenix, died on Halloween in 1993, right in the middle of some of the most demanding sequences of the shoot. Director Jan de Bong quietly reshuffled the entire production schedule to give Keanu space to breathe, moving him onto smaller, quieter scenes while he processed the loss. During breaks, Keanu would go back to his trailer and read Hamlet. That grief, handled privately and with a kind of quiet dignity, added something real and raw to Jack Traven that no director could have scripted. Sandra saw all of this. She was right there. And what she saw was a man who was hurting but still showing up, still doing the work, still being kind and funny and generous between takes even when he had every reason not to be. The chemistry between them did not start with the script. It started in the audition room. Sandra later described having to do physical scenes during her audition that involved rolling around on the floor with Keanu to test whether they had any real connection. At one point, Keanu accidentally grabbed her and got a handful of something he was not supposed to get a handful of. He went completely red. He started falling over himself, trying to explain and apologize. Sandra just laughed and told him she knew exactly what he was doing. That moment of pure human awkwardness, that inability to stay cool under pressure, was somehow the most honest and charming thing that could have happened. And it told her everything she needed to know about who he was. Now here is where the wet spot scene comes in, and here is why it hit the way it did. There is a moment during filming where Keanu's natural, unscripted charm just completely broke through the wall of professionalism that actors build around themselves on a working set. The tension that had been accumulating between them, the closeness, the grief, the laughter, the long days on a hot highway, all of it was sitting just below the surface every single time the cameras rolled. And in that particular scene, it came out. Sandra Bullock, one of the most composed and technically skilled actresses of a generation, could not hold it together. She broke. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because something had gone exactly right in a way that no rehearsal and no script could have predicted or prepared her for. She admitted years later, in a 2018 appearance on The Ellen DeGeneres Show, that she had a massive crush on Keanu the entire time they were filming Speed. She said it was nearly impossible to be serious around him because he was, in her words, too sweet and too handsome. She spent years after production assuming the feeling was not mutual. She assumed there was something about her that had not quite landed with him. She carried that quiet, slightly bruised assumption for over 2 decades. And then, a few months after Sandra's confession, Keanu sat down in that same chair on that same show and told the entire world that he had a crush on her too. Neither of them had known. They had been right there on that bus together, both completely gone for the other person, and neither one had said a word about it. 2 people who made cinematic history together and then went home separately and carried a secret that did not need to be a secret. Their friendship in the years that followed was exactly what you would expect from 2 people who genuinely adored each other and were too careful about it to do anything reckless. Sandra kept in touch through letters and phone calls, especially after Keanu's motorcycle accidents. They had dinners together. They went to each other's events. When Sandra was honored at an awards ceremony and her co-stars stood up to say kind things about her, it was Keanu's speech that made her cry. He looked straight at her and told her that her soul and her talent were extraordinary. And then, because he is Keanu Reeves, he finished the speech by telling her she was definitely hot. There's also the story of the champagne and truffles. Sandra mentioned once, casually, that she had never tried champagne and truffles. A few days later, Keanu showed up at her front door with both. He did not come inside. He did not make it a moment. He just dropped them off because he thought she should know what they tasted like, and then he went home. Sandra has told that story multiple times over the years, and she always sounds a little amazed by it, the way you sound when you are describing someone who is almost too good to be real. When asked why they never actually dated, Sandra was honest about it. She said she was afraid that a breakup might cost her one of the most important friendships in her life. But she also said, quietly, that Keanu is such a genuinely good person that they probably could have survived it just fine. They reunited on screen in 2006 for The Lake House, a romantic drama where their characters were separated by 2 years of time and could only communicate through a magical mailbox. Even with that deliberately impossible premise between them, even playing people who literally could not be in the same room at the same time, the chemistry was still right there. Still undeniable. Because you cannot manufacture what those 2 have. Sandra has said that her dream for the future, the movie she actually wants to make with Keanu before they are too old to do it, is a comedy where they play 2 elderly people driving an RV across the country very slowly and infuriating everyone around them. She calls it the bookend to Speed. In Speed, they could not slow down or everything would blow up. In this one, they would spend the whole movie taking their time and driving the world absolutely crazy. It is a perfect idea. It is exactly the kind of idea that only comes from someone who has known another person long enough and well enough to see the beautiful symmetry of the whole thing. That wet spot moment on set was not just a blooper. It was not an accident. It was the moment when 30 years of friendship and one of Hollywood's greatest misconnections announced itself to the world before either of them had the words to explain it. It was the proof that some sparks do not care about professionalism or timing or what is sensible or safe. Some sparks just go off. And no bomb, no rig bus, no Hollywood screenplay has ever been able to capture that kind of explosion on purpose. It only happens when it is real. That is why we are still talking about it. That is why you clicked on this video. Because deep down, everyone wants to believe that something that real is actually possible. And in 1994, on a hot highway in Los Angeles, on a bus that could not slow down, it absolutely was. If you have ever had a moment where you just could not keep it together around someone, drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you hit subscribe because we are just getting started.